Chapter 15. Yes, Vladimir was a young exceptional. With a conduct and high morals so far, by above the average, and this sometimes was causing envy, misunderstanding and even ill will from a good part of people around him. He was a young, very intelligent and educated, enough to accomplish great things. He was like one of those skinny guys who use goggles, apparently weak chiefly by the hunger, who spent the most of Cubans in those difficult times. All thought Vladimir was handsome. Vladimir loves the arts. The painting, cinema, theater, literature, etc., but above all the music. He saw in music the opportunity to express in a universal language and with a sense, let's say that of philosophical teaching, to guide people toward a full and free life. Vladimir had to stop the music at the end of the elemental level, in one of the music conservatories of the city, because the situation in the country with public transport and in general was very difficult. They were very hard years, in total survival, although this young man seemed to have a will of steel. In those difficult days, were scarce in the country products like flour, and the state began to sell it in the market only 80 grams of bread per person per day. There was no more bread in the whole city, only 80 grams of bread per person per day. Rice, a daily and traditional food of Cuban families, as well as beans, became scarce, and Vladimir had to go every so often with his father to the peoples by train, to more than 100 kilometers, to buy the support of the family, support that was a minimal. His day after day was terrible. He got up at 6 a.m. to go to work and study at a school of civil construction. It was not in his profile, this kind of work, but receives a paid by study and practice, and by then there was not much to choose from. Vladimir did not eat breakfast, he kept the daily bread for the evening, to accompany, also the daily plate of rice and beans, which was all what the family could get, as the vast majority of Cubans of the time. There was people who had even less, like a cauliflower soup for example, or still so much worse. It was said that there were those who had died of hunger or as a result of all this. At school were paid the equivalent of about €6 per month, while the national average salary were about 10. Moreover, was not simply wait the bus at the stop to go to work and study center. Almost there is no buses, and not passed, because oil and spare parts coming from the former USSR and other socialist countries became scarce. From those countries always had arrived the majority of raw materials. On top of all this, the US blockade against the revolution raged, in order that finish sinking. And there was talk by the national media until option 0. As scarce buses, and many times were delayed, even hours to pass, many people used, to continue forward to work, rides, 2, 3. According to the distance and the circumstances. Sometimes one had to make a great sprint behind buses, which come crowded with people and stopped before or after the official bus stops. Sometimes also the buses were put launched and many people was hanging indoors and windows, risking their lives to go to work or to study. What imagination! Would say people that not lived it. Yet Vladimir never missed a class or workshops of the same. And what is more, always, at the rest time, he walked away with his drumsticks looking for a place to study percussion. Then at 6 p.m. Vladimir went to the Conservatory of Music, with a bestial hunger and fatigue, to study 4 hours, and after that, go home, often after midnight, to eat that bowl of rice with beans and the bread that he had kept. The weekends were not to rest. Weekends were for looking for rice and beans. So, day after day, about to turn his 26 years. One day Vladimir felt he could no more. The situation choked him. Nearly 20 years of a life of constant effort with many attempts to overcoming, of acquisition of education and culture, thinking that this will be worth it, that this bad moment that we're passing would be overcome, where sometimes he would weep imagining that he would die of hunger, and smudged with his tears your old diary written in ink. Yes. Vladimir also carried a daily. He thought that would come better times for the most prepared and slaughtered. Also he thought that one day he would go to publish all these things, for reports, before the startled eyes of the world, everything that he had been suffered as a Cuban of those times. Nothing. He saw no light at end of the tunnel. But his intelligence was clouded at that time, and he thought about suicide, in a fastest form. A walking distance of their school would be spending a fairly fast train for that time. It was a very dramatic moment, perhaps the most dramatic than had. The suicide of his loved godmother, a few years ago, the separation of their parents, being very young, his time in the military service obligatory, his failed romance with a beautiful and young lady who was a Jehovah's Witness, while he was searching for God, all came to his mind as film footage, but all these problems seemed little compared to the desperate time he was living. Poor, almost alone and misunderstood, facing an uncertain future. He was losing totally faith. Yes, Vladimir also had loved God, but that day, for the first time in its history as believer, had completely lost his faith, as Didymus, when had painted the Christ back, while he was walked toward the railway, wept bitter and inconsolably, because he was a man determined and firm in his ideas. The train looked a little still far away, but passing near of a bush, and saving the distance with the biblical Moses, blew a strong breeze and he heard a voice that said, "My son, don't do it." Vladimir dropped to his knees on the grass and the rapid train passed, a few meters from him, while the driver put her hands to the head. Vladimir shook and cried until he was calm, like that breeze which left him stroking, giving way to a voice that said, "Still a mission and good things await you, my beloved son. You're my only." Vladimir could not believe what he had witnessed. There was not a person in more than 40 meters around. He stood up and went back to school calmer, to no one he told what happened.